dear UPSC and NPSC aspirants. Welcome to the Hindu Daily Editorial and Current Affairs Analysis. Today we'll be looking into the news of 9th July 2026. So today's agenda is going to range from environment and ecology and all the way to history and culture. In the front page, we see four important news. One is about Trump ends Iran truce and the talks to go on. And then Russian oil share tops 40% of the India's imports. And Bisnoy and Brar ordered Niger's killing as per the US Department of Justice. Over 31% jump in the higher education enrollment rate. First, we will be covering with the news of environment and ecology. So, first news is about the rains in the Western Ghats. The Indian Meteorological Department recorded exceptional rainfall over Maharashtra's Western Ghats. Lonavala, which is a hill tourist town, it received 1300 mm from Sunday to Wednesday morning, and the coastal Palghat region had logged 304 mm against a normal of 26 mm, which is a departure of about 1000%. And similarly, Mahabaleshwar have received 513 mm in a single day. It is the highest ever 24-hour rainfall and nearly one-tenth of its annual rainfall. Now, on IMD scale, rainfall above 200 mm per day is classed as extremely high. This point is important from the prelims perspective, and the downpour had wiped out the season's monsoon deficit in several coastal regions at a stroke. But another implication of it is it has triggered landslides, a tunnel collapse, and disruption, showing how good rainfall figure on paper can mean disaster on ground. So, this monsoon spell and this heavy rainfall spell was driven by a depression, which is a pre-cyclonic low pressure cluster of the clouds formed over the Bay of Bengal and combined with the strong monsoon winds from the Arabian Sea. The crucial paradox is 2026 is an El Nino year, where El Nino is essentially the warming of the eastern Pacific, which typically weakens the Indian monsoon. So, all India rainfall was forecast to be below the normal, yet IMD scientist O.P. Srijit explains that even in the rain deficient years, short intense bursts of rain can still occur in localized pockets. So, the main takeaway is that seasonal averages mask deadly extremes. So, climate change is loading more moisture into short spells. That is why cloudbursts are spelling disaster, especially for the urban areas with the flooding. So the steep and deforested slopes and the choked urban drains of the Ghats convert into floods and collapse. So the implication is disaster planning must shift from having seasonal totals to hourly predictions and hyperlocal forecasting for better management. So from Main's angle, climate change intensifying the extreme short duration rainfall and the fragility of the Western Ghats. And we have to read it from the perspective of Madhav Gadgil report and Kasturi Rangan panel report on the ecologically sensitive areas of Western Ghats. And the dimensions to look for is how to improve the weather forecasting and land use planning, urban drainage rejuvenation, and then slope safety. So the way forward is having hyperlocal forecasting and early warning systems to be deployed. Slope stabilization must be done, and strict regulation of the construction must be done in the ecologically sensitive areas and climate proof the urban drainage system. Next news is about the Amarnath Yatra. PDP leader Irjita Mufti has alleged that the annual Amarnath pilgrimage is exceeding the pilgrim ceiling prescribed by the Supreme Court, and the official figures show 1.13 lakh pilgrims have completed the darshan in just 5 days of the 57-day yatra. So an average of about 22,000 a day, which is more than double the Supreme Court mandated cap of 10,000 a day. So the photographs are circulating on uh, social media, suggesting that the naturally formed ice lingam uh, has already melted within a week of the yatra beginning. So, Mufti has flagged unnecessary construction and sheer footfall of the devotees and the ambitious ropeway project accelerating the ecological damage to the high altitude cave shrine, which sits deep in the Kashmir Himalayas. So, the core concept which we need to focus upon here is the carrying capacity, which essentially is the maximum number of the visitors a fragile ecosystem can absorb before it degrades irreversibly. When the footfall runs at twice the scientific cap, the microclimate of the cave warms, and the heavy infrastructure will disturb the slopes, and the ice formation melts faster. This episode captures recurring Himalayan tension, religious tension on one hand, and lucrative pilgrimage tourism on one side, and the ecological preservation on the other. So, environment has no power currency in politics. That is very true, and it echoes the pressures on the Char Dham route and the disasters like Jyotimat land subsidence, which had happened way back in 2022, where over construction and mass tourism in young, unstable mountain ranges had produced cascading harm. So the implication is, without enforcing the limits, faith tourism can consume the very shrine it celebrates. So, uh, carrying capacity-based regulation is necessary for Himalayan pilgrimages. So we need to balance ecology on one hand and faith and local livelihoods on the other hand. Sustainable ecotourism is the way, and scientifically set and enforced daily caps must be followed, and a mandatory environmental impact assessment must be made for the ropeway, and real-time crowd monitoring must be done, and a long-term sustainable tourism policy for Himalayan glaciers and shrines must be put in place. Next, let us look at the economy. So first, the news is about Russia crosses 40% of India's oil imports. As per official Commerce and Industry Ministry data, Russia's share of India's crude oil imports rose above 40% in May 2026 to 40.5% by volume and 42.6% by value. This is the highest in nearly 2 years. So the striking twist is the pricing. Russia, which was still selling India's oil at a discount as recently as February, now is charging a premium of about $916 per ton versus India's overall average import price of roughly $870 per ton. So even as US and UAE sold to India below the average. So India's total crude imports were 21.82 million tons in May 2026. This is the highest since January 2026 and above 12% 12% above the April. This shows that demand is firm even as the sourcing is shifting. And the premium is possible because India and China lean on heavily on the discounted Russian barrels. This gives the Moscow pricing power now that the global crude has climbed. So India's crude basket averaged about $106 per barrel in May 2026 against just $64 a year earlier. The price surge and not the volume is why India's import bill has jumped 23.5% over April and 66% over May 2025. In parallel, the Hindu analysis also shows that India actively is diversifying. It has resumed buying oil from Iran and Venezuela after US has eased the curbs. So the implication is energy security now hinges on navigating the sanctions on one hand, keeping many suppliers in play, and managing the current account deficit and rupee pressure, which is a costlier bill will bring. So the premium being charged by the Russia in effect will lead is because of the price of over reliance on one supplier. So the way forward is to build the strategic petroleum reserves and push the renewables and the ethanol blending to cut the demand and sign the diversified long-term contracts and keep refining flexible enough to process many crudes. And what we need to understand is the vulnerability of India as it imports about 85 to 90% of the crude. We will look into how India has cushioned the West Asia oil shock. So, while the US and Iran clashes have renewed over the Strait of the Hormuz, okay, which carries much of the world's oil. Brent crude is up by 7.4% across the two sessions to over $77.3 per barrel. And Nifty and Sensex have fallen by over 2%. And the rupee has weakened 52 paise to reach 95.48 rupees per dollar. So, the article argues that India managed the wider crisis far better than the peers, and the petrol prices rose just only 7.5% in India versus 14% in Germany, 19% in UK, 45% in US, and over 50% in Pakistan and in Philippines, and nearly 90% in Myanmar. Diesel rose only 8% compared to a 85% jump in United Arab Emirates, and then domestic LPG cylinder was held at 942, and for Ujjwala beneficiaries it is at 642 rupees. So India imports about 90% of its crude and it is heavily dependent on the Gulf. So a blockage of the Strait of Hormuz is a systemic threat to India. So the four questions have absorbed the shock. One, having the strategic relationships while Iran has facilitated the movement of the Indian ships, and the Gulf ties have kept the supply channels open. Second, a diversified supplier base spanning from Russia on one hand, USA, Africa, and Latin America, and a decade of energy planning with higher ethanol blending and a growing renewable space and strategic reserves and expanding the refinery. So the whole of the government approach across Ministry of External Affairs, Petroleum, Ports and Shipping, the Indian Navy, and the National Security Council Secretariat all have come together. This is the reason why India is able to manage the West Asia crisis better. So the cost of shielding the consumers fell on the state-run oil marketing companies, which have absorbed the losses of 74,781 crore rupees up to the June 30. So this had helped in protecting the household budgets and straining the public sector balance sheets. So this is a trade-off between uh, uh, the fiscal stability on one hand and the price stability on the other hand. So, so the article highlights the fiscal cost of administered price stabilization, and the way forward is essentially deepening the strategic petroleum reserves and accelerate adoption of renewables and ethanol to cut the demand, and then hedge the crude purchases and diversify the shipping routes away from a single choke point. Next, let us look at the fiscal federalism strain. So, a data point analysis finds that the union and the state welfare allocations for the 2005-26 is at 24.20 lakh crore or 6.77% of the GDP. But the union's share is only 1.89% of GDP, with states bearing the majority of the welfare spending. Over the past decade, the real rise in the social services spending has come mainly from the states, while the center's share had stayed almost flat. While India's tax to GDP ratio is comparable to the middle income groups, it lags badly on the social security spending as a share of the GDP. So this is a link of concern. So Himachal Pradesh Chief Minister has warned that replacing the fully central funded Manrega with the new VBG scheme, which requires the state to cover 10% of the cost in case of the special category states, and in case of normal states, states have to cover 40% of the cost, will further strain in resource poor states, especially. So the structural problem is vertical fiscal imbalance between the union government on one hand and the states on the other hand. So the union commands most buoyant and elastic taxes, yet the responsibility for funding the welfare schemes is falling on the fiscally constrained states. So the welfare model itself has shifted. In early 2000s, we have seen a rights-based regime which had enacted Manrega, which gives a uh, guarantee to the right to employment guarantee to the people. But in the last decade, it has pivoted towards the cash transfers, with the states alone spending about 4.14 lakh crore on unconditional transfers as per 16th Finance Commission report. Now, the cost sharing formulas in the Integrated Child Development Scheme and the Pradhan Mantri Matru Vandan Yojana are split again between the center and the state at 60-40 ratio. And for Manrega, it is 90-10 in the in Manrega it was 90-10. So any dilution of the center share quietly loads more onto the states. So the implication is cooperative federalism is strained and the sustainability of the welfare guarantees depends on a fairer division of the fiscal burden between the union and the states. So here the role of the finance commission, the latest finance commission, and the devolution and the tax sharing will come into play, and rights-based welfare versus the cash transfers on the other hand. So the way forward is to raise the union social sector commitments and rationalize the cost sharing of the centrally sponsored schemes and expand the state's fiscal space and protect the statutory guarantees which are given by the statute, and it has to protect the people from cost shifting to the states. Next, let us look at the sectors of the economy. So India has become the world's fourth largest LNG regasification market. As per International Gas Union, the World LNG report, India added 52.5 million tons per annum of regasification capacity. This ability to turn the imported liquefied natural gas back into gas for a pipeline grid across the 8 terminals, thus overtaking Spain to become the fourth largest regasification market in 2025. So, the Dahej LNG plant is India's only ultra-large terminal, and it ranks sixth globally. And the other seven are large scale with 5 million tons per annum capacity each. In 2025, India has commissioned new onshore Chhara LNG and expanded the Dabhol to 5 MTPA from existing 2.9 MTPA, thereby completing a breakwater which finally allows the year-round and monsoon-proof operations for the LNG regasification. So the build-out is driven by rising demand for fertilizer, city gas distribution, and utilities, plus the government's goal of raising the natural gas share in the energy mix because gas is seen as a cleaner transition fuel between coal and the renewables. Four more projects are under construction. One new terminal and three expansions include the Hedge, which will add about 11.3 MTPA by 2028, and International Energy Agency projects India's gas demand to rise to nearly 60% by 2030. Yet, a caution is there in the data that the regasification capacity utilization has fell to about 47% in 2025 from earlier 58% in 2024. This is because of the weak summer LNG imports met the freshly added capacity. And Asia led global additions in 2025 entirely from China and India, with China having an addition of 15.1 MTPA and India adding 7.1 MTPA. So the implications are infrastructure is running ahead of the demand and the imports remain sensitive to the volatile global liquefied natural gas prices. So from a mains perspective, what is important is role of natural gas as a transition fuel, gas-based economy and the energy security of India, import dependence and the price exposure. So the way forward is extend the city gas pipeline connection to lift the utilization and the aggregate demand, and then contract the LNG competitively across the states, and then boost the domestic gas output to reduce the imports. Next news is about the Kharif season sowing is lagging despite the monsoon revival. A high-level committee has reviewed the El Nino conditions and said that the monsoon situation has improved in India as the overall rainfall deficit has narrowed from 33% in June to 24% in July. And the number of rain deficient districts fell from 262 to 178. However, the Kharif season sowing stood at 350.85 lakh hectares, and this is 91.95 lakh hectares less than the same period last year. This is because of the delayed monsoon onset, especially had hurt the soybean and cotton crops, and farmers were therefore advised to switch to short duration crops and low water crops such as maize, bajra, and moong to make up for the lost time. A late erratic monsoon in El Nino year will threaten the kharif output, the rural incomes, and the food inflation. This is a change which matters for the whole economy given how monsoon dependent Indian agriculture remains. The center says it's planned ahead and contingency plans prepared with the ICAR for the likely affected districts were shared with the states by April. And a Khet Bachao Abhiyan ran 1.24 lakh programs reaching about 80 lakh farmers in June. So the falling deficit is reassuring, but the sowing gap is the real risk indicator. If the acreage stays behind, then the output will fall and the prices will rise in the months coming up. So the implication is the crop mix shifts will happen, and the minimum support price and the procurement pressures will rise, and inflation management all will follow from these early season sowing numbers. So uh, our agriculture is dependent upon the monsoon, and we need to shift towards a climate resilient agriculture. So, what is the importance of the crop diversification for food security and inflation? So, the way forward is to promote the drought tolerant and the short duration varieties and expand the micro irrigation and then strengthen the crop insurance and deliver real time agro advisories. Next, let us look at polity and governance. So, the Delhi High Court lays down the framework for the right to be forgotten. In Lakshmir Singh Yadav versus Union of India case, the Delhi High Court decided a batch of 30 consolidated petitions and laid down the principles governing the right to be forgotten, that is, the right to have information erased or de-indexed from the search results when its continued online visibility is harmful and serves no public interest. So the court held that this right flows from Article 21 of the Constitution, which guarantees dignity and informational privacy, applying a structured proportionality test. That is, retaining information must serve a legitimate purpose, and the harm to privacy must be weighed against the public interest, and least intrusive remedy, such as masking the names rather than deleting the judgments altogether, should be preferred. It set a 2 week deadline for the legal databases to comply and clarified that only the parties' names are redacted and not the facts of the case. So the idea began with 2014 European Union case of Mario Costeza Gonzalez, which led to Article 17 of the GDPR, which is the data protection law of the European Union. In India, the case Puttaswamy versus Union of India case of 2017 made privacy a fundamental right under Article 21. But afterwards, the High Courts took the divergent views, leading to no coherent test. So, this ruling now supplies that framework. So, the right to be forgotten sits in tension with the free speech on one and press on one hand and the principle of open justice. So, this is not an absolute right. So, the hardest part of this right is like enforcement. How to do the de-indexing? How de-indexing helps at the search level, but it cannot erase the mirror sites, archives, or the social media copies. So, the statutory backdrop is weak, which is our Data Protection Act of 2023, which offers only a limited and consent-based erasure section under the Section 12. It is silent on the judicial records and remains a half-built because its rules are unnotified and the Data Protection Board is not yet operational. So, from a mains perspective, uh, uh, the right to be forgotten balances privacy on and the open justice and free speech on other hand. So India's data protection architecture, it can be asked about what are the provisions of the DPDP Act and what has not been what is implemented so far and what is yet to be implemented, and the digital rights in the platform age. And the way forward is to notify the DPDP rules and operationalize the data protection boards and adopt a tied mechanism for the platforms, which will then flow to the boards and then ultimately to the courts for judicial review and pay the legal orders with the genuine technical compliance. Next one about the census 2027, about the caste checkbox. So the pre-test for the second phase of the census 2027 is underway in the 16 states and union territories since July the 6th, and it carries an open column where a respondent state their caste and the enumerator record it verbatim. Unlike the 2011 socioeconomic caste census, this caste count has statutory backing within the census itself. The checkbox editorial warns that open-ended answers yield unusable data, just like we have seen in the 2011 socioeconomic caste census, which produced over 46 lakh distinct caste names, against just 4,147 in 1931 census. So the last, because people entered surnames, subcastes, clan names interchangeably, and this inflated the count into incoherence. The center itself told the Supreme Court in 2021 that the SECC figures were too error-ridden to use for reservation, and this pretest will end on July the 20th. So, in India, caste is an abstract and hierarchical identity. Unlike the language, religion, or gender, it is not a simple attribute. So, the very act of recording it risks ossifying it. So the only sound rationale is for counting it as it is that the self-perceived or imposed caste creates real inequalities, and the better data can sharpen the welfare and affirmative action targeting by the governments and inform contested debates on the creamy layer and subcategorization of the quotas. To avoid the socioeconomic caste census mess, the editorial recommends using the digital census handheld device with preloaded with a curated list of the castes and the subcastes, so the enumerator can select the correct standardized entry. The approach, which was followed by 2020-23 Bihar caste survey and yields suggested yields are more usable. So the implication is the methodology and not the intent, which will decide whether the caste count is analytically valuable or is a costly exercise in statistical noise. So actually the use of recording the caste is like it is useful especially for the doing affirmative action, especially for uh, uh, directing the funds for the different welfare schemes. That is why it must be recorded. Next, we will look into CBSE's supplementary exam and the promise of no injustice. So we all know that CBSE's on-screen marking had went into a big controversy, had drawn a big controversy at a national level. So the digital evaluation of the scanned answer scripts, three developments had collided. First, CBSE had announced a Class 12 supplementary exam, letting the students improve the marks. Second, the Central Information Commission directed the CBSE to frame transparent, time-bound, standard operating procedures for giving students their marks, answer sheets, and their assessment records. Third, within a month of appointing a new CBSE chairperson, the government reverted him to an interim additional charge arrangement. So, this uh, editorial argues that making the students resit an exam before they can even verify their original scripts treats the consequences and not the cause of it. So, the scale shows why the verification matters. Of about 17.7 lakh class 12 students, only 4 lakh got access to the 11 lakh scripts out of the 98 lakhs. So nearly 14 lakhs never saw their evaluated answer scripts and only 1.6 lakh reached re-evaluation. So even in that small sample, the revisions were dramatic in nature. One history script rose from 74 marks to all the way to 97 marks. And one student became the CBSE topper after re-evaluation lifted them to 100 out of 100 in all five subjects. implying many genuine errors were uncaught. So the Central Information Commissioner, invoking Section 25(5) of the RTI Act, called time-bound SOPs the dire need of today's scenario, framing this as a citizen's right to access their own records. So the implication is the real issue is transparency and accountability in the high stakes evaluation and not merely offering a retest. So the way forward is to publish the time bound SOPs and give universal free access to the digitized answer scripts and ensure that the verification precedes any supplementary exam which CBSE is planning. Let's look at international relations. So regarding the US-Iran truce collapse, at a NATO summit in Ankara, US President declared the US-Iran ceasefire is over after tit-for-tat overnight strikes, leaving the door open to further talks. Iran claimed it had 85 US military assets in Persian Gulf in response to US strikes on monitoring and surveillance centers along Iran's southern coast of Bandar Abbas and uh, Bushehr. This case killed 8 Iranian personnel. So the US Central Command said it struck over 80 targets, including 8 defense systems, the radar sites, and the IRGC small boats to degrade Iran's ability to attack the commercial shipping. So India's Minister of External Affairs voiced deep concern about this and urged all parties to exercise restraint and return to dialogue. So at the heart of the crisis is the control of the Strait of Hormuz, which is a choke point between the Persian Gulf on one hand and the Gulf of Oman, through which almost one-fifth of the world's seaborne oil passes. So the June 17 Memorandum of Understanding promised safe passage of the tankers, and Iran opened a coastal designated route. After 3 tankers using an alternative Omani coast were attacked over the weekend, US revoked a post-MOU sanctions waiver on Iranian oil and launched the strikes. So the two fault lines doomed the MOU. One, Israel's continuing war with Lebanon, which Article 1 ceasefire was meant to cover, and the disputed status of the strait, which Article 5 60-day free passage clause. Iran suspects US used the MOU to replenish the global oil markets and strip Tehran's leverage. So Trump's dilemma is pressure isn't restoring the status quo, but full-scale war would wreck diplomacy and leave Iran's nuclear file unresolved. So, the way forward, the West Asia is quite important for India because of the energy choke points, because India has oil stakes and India has a large diaspora staying in the Gulf and whose remittances are critical for India's balance of payments and the trade with the West Asia. Now, the way forward is the de-escalation of the crisis, and internationally backed safe passage guarantees must be given, and India need to have and do a balancing act with respect to the diplomacy with both the powers on both the sides. Then there is another op-ed by Rajiv Agarwal which argues that despite more than 40 days of combined US-Israel attacks, Iran is projecting pride, defiance, and resilience rather than defeat. So the funeral of the slain Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei drew millions of mourners and high-level representatives from Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, Egypt, Iraq, Pakistan, Armenia, and even the Taliban government of Afghanistan. While the entire Western Bloc and the Gulf states like UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait were pointedly absent. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps remain completely in control, and the Iran's nuclear and the ballistic missiles program stay off the negotiating table. So the other frames this as Revolution 2.0, echoing the 1979 Iranian Revolution. So the piece has identified 4 shifts. One is the security architecture, that the myth of US protection, under which the Gulf Cooperation Council was formed in 1981, and US stationed thousands of its troops, is shattered now that the US bases and the Gulf states themselves took the Iranian strikes, pushing some towards a peace with Iran. Second, the regime survival. Uh, while it has weakened before by the sanctions and the December 2025 protests relating to inflation and collapse of the Iranian currency rial to 1.54 million per dollar, so the regime survived a brutal crackdown and emerged stronger. So, uh, where 1979 has gave Iran a religion-first identity, this war has made national pride the primary agent of resilience and defense. And fourth, while a windfall looms from the East sanctions, the resumed crude and gas sales and the defrozen assets and the monetization of the Strait of Hormuz, it is possible the revival of the economy is very much possible. For India, the war marked noticeably tilt towards the Israel, US, and UAE bloc and forcing a deliberate, delicate and recalibration of the ties between both the sides. So, this West Asia crisis is important for India for the balancing act between Iran and the Israel, US, and Gulf bloc. And India has invested heavily in the Chabahar port in Iran. Now, what is the future of that port? And what about the international north-south transit corridor connectivity, which aims to connect India all the way till Russia through through Iran and the European countries. Now, this is also doubtful, and the strategic autonomy of India not to be forced by either blocks. So, the way forward is to recalibrate the tides pragmatically and protect the energy and the connectivity interests of India and hedge across the competing blocks. Next, US Department of Justice said that the jail gangster Lawrence Bishnoi and his associate Satinderjit Singh has ordered the June 18, 2023 assassination of pro-Khalistani terrorist Hardeep Singh Nijjar in Surrey, British Columbia in Canada. That killing had badly strained the India-Canada relations with then Prime Minister Trudeau, alleging that the involvement of the agents of the Indian government. So the investigations under Operation Hardball had run jointly by the law enforcement in US, Canada, and Europe, and they charged 37 accused, including a serving Punjab police inspector. Federal Bureau of Investigation had declared a $50,000 reward for Goldie Brar or Satinderjit Singh's arrest, and about 1,000 kg of cocaine was seized. Department of Justice says that Bishnoi's enterprise routinely targeted prominent religious, social, and political leaders with violence to terrorize and extort. So DOJ alleges that Bishnoi ran the racket from inside Sabarmati jail uh, using the smuggled cell phones and encrypted apps like WhatsApp, extorting up to $5 million from US victims as recently as December January, mirroring the NIA 2022 charge sheet that he runs an entire operation from within the jail. So India has designated Nijjar as a terrorist in 2020, and Bishnoi faces 84 cases as per National Investigation Agency of India and is under 24/7 surveillance. So the case knits together several important threads like transnational organized crime, the Khalistani networks in Indian diaspora, the delicate India-Canada-US diplomatic triangle, the glaring prison security failures, so the fresh pressure on the Punjab's law and order after the FBI has publicly named serving police inspector as part of the nexus. So the way forward is to strengthen extradition and the mutual legal assistance treaties and secure the present telecommunications and coordinate action against the transnational organized crime. Next, Prime Minister Modi is in Australia as part of the three-nation visit. So the Indian diaspora is officially Australia's largest overseas-born community, overtaking the England-born population for the first time. So this is a genuine inflection point for a nation whose population was anchored for 2 centuries by the British derived majority. So, Prime Minister's third visit uh, features a large public gathering billed as Melbourne meets Modi, and the bilateral relationship has matured from the old three C's, which were cricket, curry, and Commonwealth, to more substantive four Ds, which is democracy, defense, diaspora, and dosti. This is underpinned by the Quad grouping, the India, Australia, US, Japan grouping, which anchors both countries' Indo Pacific strategy. Australia's Indian community is comparatively younger, and significant professional migration began only in 1960s and 70s. After the racist white Australia policy was dismantled and large share arrived during the post 2014 New India years. This left the cohort tightly bound to India through family, business, remittance, and a resurgence of nationalist identity. But it now lands in a tense moment as an anti-immigration backlash with March for Australia rallies rising all across Australia and Rising One Nation Party and increasingly cast the community as too large, too fast, and too visible. So for India, the diaspora is source of the pride and strategic bridge, and the article cautions that the both sides need evidence-based understanding of how it actually lives and participate, and not just the headline income and the trade statistics, if it is to be a genuine pillar of the partnership. So the way forward is to invest in the diaspora research and the social cohesion and treat diaspora as a genuine partnership pillar rather than a symbolic prop. Let us look at the Hamas Trail. Hind Rajab Foundation, which is a Brussels-based Palestinian uh, body, has filed a complaint on June 2nd, 2026 with India's Home Ministry, the Bureau of Immigration, and the police to arrest Aitan Gilboa, an Israeli soldier who was found vacationing in Himachal Pradesh, accusing him of war crimes in Gaza, and submitting the geolocated videos and the chain of command documentation. India, which is signatory to the Fourth Geneva Convention, has enacted the Geneva Conventions Act of 1960, under which it can arrest any person, regardless of the nationality or where the offence was committed, for a grave breach. If the arrest is not possible, the Home Ministry and the Bureau of Immigration can facilitate deportation. Gilboa ultimately fled India, and the Union government issued no statement and initiated no probe. The Hamas Trail is the informal network of Indian destinations like Kasol, which is like mini Israel, Kodaikanal, Kerala, Goa, Hampi, and others, which are frequented by 80,000 Israelis a year, many of them young post-service veterans on the TL Gadol. In February 2026, Israel even allocated 4 million NIS to boost the tourism collaboration with India. The issue draws uh, global scrutiny because India-Israel tourism is part of deepening the normalization, even as Israel faces a genocide case at the International Court of the Justice, which was filed by South Africa. So, in Gaza, 73,000 plus Palestinians have been killed since October 7, 2023, and UN Commission of Inquiry has found the acts inflicting death and severe bodily and mental harm on children, and the HRF has already secured recognition of the universal jurisdiction over Gaza war crimes in the courts in Brazil, Romania, Peru, Belgium, Canada, and Chile. So India's silence sits uneasily with its own treaty obligations. So the way forward is to have clear domestic enforcement of the IHL and have consistent treaty uh, compliance and careful diplomatic balancing. Next, let us look at science and technology. So, there's a feature written on the quantum computing. So, this feature explains that the quantum computer is an idea rooted in Paul Benioff's 1980 quantum Turing machine, which uses qubits instead of the classic bits. And thanks to the superposition, a qubit can be a 0 or 1 or any state in between at once, like a spinning coin that is both heads and tails until it lands. And thanks to the quantum entanglement, the qubits become linked so that measuring one instantly affects the another regardless of the distance. So making this machine a massively parallel machine. And this is very useful in the problems like searching, sorting, simulating molecules, cryptography, and optimizing the complex networks. And India's National Quantum Mission had sanctioned over 6,000 crores in April 2023 and aims by 2031 to build intermediate scale quantum computers and make India a leading quantum nation as per Department of Science and Technology. But the bottleneck is the hardware noise. So the qubits are extremely fragile and interaction with the environment causes decoherence, which is loss of quantum state. So they must be cooled to near absolute zero, which is minus 273 degrees Celsius. And today's error rates are 1% to 0.1% versus roughly 1 to 1 in a quintillion for classic computers. So the fix is error correction, forcing many physical qubits to act as one reliable logic qubit, and the Google's quantum processor Willow, which was launched in 2024, showed in 2024 Nature paper that scaling the lattice halves the errors, and this is a big milestone. And the Google targets useful applications within the 5 years, and IBM by 2029. And but the experts like IISc's Arindam Ghosh and IIT Madras's Prabhu Rajgopal urge caution against the hype, noting that the classical computing is not going away. So the implication is a real quantum leap would upend cryptography, material science, and climate modeling. And the way forward is to build a talent plus hardware ecosystem and fund the error correction research and prepare secure communication systems for post-quantum world. Next news is about artificial intelligence leap in finding the code flaws. OpenAI said its most powerful model, GPT 5.6, which is released in three tiers, okay, will launch publicly after the US government reportedly approved a broader release. So GPT 5.6 and other frontier models, including Anthropic Mythos series, have drawn concerns for the unprecedented ability to identify the weaknesses in the software code that the hackers could exploit, raising the national security fears. Because of that, OpenAI had first shared the preview access only with limited group of the trusted US-based partners at Washington's request. Separately, Indian IT firm UST entered a strategic alliance with Anthropic to embed its flawed models across the enterprise workflows. The large language models, which is the technology behind the chatbots and many AI tools, can now crunch code and auto discover the vulnerabilities in the code, and this capability is dual use. While the same skill helps the defenders patch the flaws, can help the attackers find these flaws, which is exactly why the governments now vet the frontier models before releasing. The commercial stakes are enormous, especially for the banking sector. OpenAI and Anthropic have both filed confidential IPO documents targeting roughly 1 trillion valuations. So the intensifying an AI arms race that pushes the capabilities out fast. Implication is the frontier AI is becoming a national security and export control question with the real risks to the critical infrastructure and growing need for AI governance frameworks that balance innovation against misuse. So the way forward is having mandatory pre-release safety testing and responsible disclosure norms and national AI security frameworks and using the same capability defensively. Next, let us look at the society and social justice. So the higher education enrollment rate is risen to 31.5%. So the All India Survey on Higher Education 2020 to 23 and 23-24 released by the Ministry of Education shows that the total student enrollment reaching 4.5 crore in 2023-24, which is a 31.5% raise from 3.42 crore in 2014-15. And this information has been drawn from 59,533 institutions with over 90% institutional participation. The female enrollment rose up by 1.57 from 1.57 crore in 14-15 to 2.24 crores. So this is up by 42.2%. So the gender parity index, that is the ratio of the female to male enrollment, stands at 1.08 for 23-24, above 1.0 for 7 straight years. So the gross enrollment ratio for 18 to 23 age group had reached 30, with the female gross enrollment ratio at 31.2, distinctly above the national baseline. So the gains are broad-based across the marginalized groups. uh, Scheduled caste enrollment rose 51.4% from just 69.72 lakhs to and the, to 69.72 lakhs, and the gross enrollment ratio risen from 18.9 to 27.8. Similarly, the ST enrollment has increased to 75.7%. Mm, so into 28.83 lakhs, and the gross enrollment ratio increased from 13.5 to 22.8. OBC enrollment has risen by 60.2% and from 1.113 crore to 1.80 crore. And coming to the STEM enrollment, which is science, technology, uh, engineering, and mathematics enrollment, it has reached 1.02 crore, and the female share in the STEM has climbed to 44% from 38.4% a decade ago. And one caveat, which is important for the interpretation, is these data are self-reported by the institutions through a web portal, and the ministry runs the validations, but the data quality ultimately rests with the institutions themselves. So the implication is this feeds the demographic dividend and the women's empowerment and tracks towards the new education policy of 2020, targeting a 50% gross enrollment ratio by 2035, even as the questions about the quality, employability, and the retention of the women in the STEM careers remain a question. Then the way forward is to raise the GER towards the 50% as envisaged in NEP 2020, and improve the quality and teaching quality and employability, build verified data systems, and retain the women in STEM careers. Next, WHO's first global cancer survey flags deep inequities. WHO's first ever survey of the people affected by the cancer is released Wednesday, reports that 20.6 million new cases and close to 10 million deaths annually, making cancer the second leading cause of death globally after the cardiovascular disease. Okay, and cancer is among the most financially and socially devastating shocks a household can face. At least 45% of the affected people experienced financial hardship, and over half have reported mental health challenges, and nearly all caregivers report strain, including the unpaid work and social isolation. So, the accompanying Global Status Report on Cancer 2026, jointly produced by WHO and the International Agency for Research on Cancer, IARC, warns that annual cases could rise to nearly 35 million by 2050 without action. So, the report's central finding is widening inequality across prevention, diagnosis, treatment, and supportive care. The 5 year survival for the breast cancer is about 87% in the high income countries, but only 42% in low income ones. A survival gap which is driven by the unequal access to the treatments. And fewer than one in the three countries include cancer care in their universal health coverage packages. So the regional burdens vary sharply, and Asia has the largest share of the cases in 2024, okay, with 50.7% of the cases and 56.5% of the deaths. This reflects its population. And Europe has carried a disproportionate 21% of the cases and 20% of the deaths, with only 9% of the world population. While parts of Africa and Asia show lower incidence but the higher mortality because of the late detection and weak treatment access. WHO chief Tedros says that survival should never depend on where you were born, or what you earned. So the implication is cancer is now a core universal health cover is now a core universal health coverage package should come, and an equity challenge, not just a medical one. So way forward is to include the cancer in UHC packages and then scale up the screening and early detection of the cancer and ensure affordable treatment and build the financial risk protection for the patients. Next, let us look at internal security and disaster management. Sri Lankan Sri Lanka prison riots killed 28 and Indian national among the dead. Uncontrolled violence in an overcrowded prison outside Colombo has killed 28 people, including 8 guards, and injured over 100 people in one of Sri Lanka's deadliest prison riots. So, Colombo-based sources said that an Indian national, Unnikrishnan Yes, was among the dead, and the Indian High Commission sent a note verbal, and the Indian inmates at the Negombo prison were transferred for safety as part of about 1,200 prisoners moved across Sri Lanka. The riots reportedly began after inmates tipped off the officials about a prison drug operation, and some then grabbed the guards' weapons and clashed with rival gangs. So, uh, the tragedy is because of the mismanagement and the chronic overcrowding of the prisons. As of December 31st, 2024, Sri Lankan prisons held 28,278 inmates against an approved capacity of just 10,395. So this is nearly the three times the capacity. And while the 2020 Human Rights Commission had already found the conditions dire, the immediate trigger is linked to the drug underworld the Disanayaka government is trying to crack down on. So the three-member committee headed by a retired Supreme Court judge will investigate, and the Human Rights Commission has flagged the torture allegations against the transferred inmates. This is third such episode after Velikada episode in 2012 and Mahara episode in 2020, underscoring a systemic pattern. So the implication for India is prison reform and the custodial rights as governance issues, plus the duty of consular protection for Indians who are interned abroad. So the way forward is to decongest the prisons, disrupt the drug networks, and enforce custodial safeguards and hold transparent probes into custodial deaths. It is also equally relevant for Indian prisons as well. Next, Kashmir counter terror operation and the NIA's online radicalization crackdown. The security forces killed an Lashkar-e-Taiba terrorist Zakir Ganai in an encounter in Chanapora area of the South Kashmir's Shopian during an anti-militancy operation that had run for 5 days. The army said the joint operation was launched on specific intelligence provided by Jammu and Kashmir police, and separately NIA conducted nationwide searches at 20 locations across several states in a case of online terror radicalization aimed at establishing an Islamic State in India through violent jihad by promoting the ideology of ISIS and ISIS, which is Al Qaeda in Indian subcontinent. So, and 11 accused were arrested and one juvenile was apprehended so far. The two operations map the evolving internal security threat in India. One phase is physical militancy in Jammu and Kashmir, where we see the Lashkar-e-Taiba infiltration and the rise of hybrid militants who blend into the civilian life. The other is virtual radicalization, where ISIS and AKIS online networks recruit across the state borders to attack the democratically elected systems. But both responses rely on the intelligence-led interagency coordination, that is, Army with Jammu and Kashmir Police in Shopian and NIA running cross-state probes, reflecting a networked counter-terror model. So the implications are the terror challenge is shifting online, raising the two questions: how to counter radicalization and lone wolf risks, while balancing the cyber security against the cyber surveillance against the civil liberties, all against the backdrop of the Jammu and Kashmir fragile normalcy. Next, we will look at the monsoon disasters. So the heavy rain had triggered a cluster of disasters. One in Wayanad, a debris slippage at an under construction tunnel road had killed 3 people. Second, we see in Pune, an under construction waste to energy plant collapsed after the rain loosened the mount accumulated waste crashed on it. And then third, in Arunachal Pradesh, we see uh, over 94,200 people spanning across 333 villages were hit by the floods and the landslides. So the common thread is extreme rainfall meeting the fragile terrain and the lax construction and the environmental clearance complaints. Wayanad probe spotlights whether the clearance conditions and the slope safety norms were followed in ecologically sensitive Western Ghats. Second, what we see in Pune and Delhi collapses point to construction safety failures and weak urban disaster preparedness. And the response capacity is visible. While an NDRF-led 60-member rescue team in Wayanad, IMD red alerts are given and school holidays have been um, proclaimed, but the sheer recurrence signals prevention gaps upstream. So the implication is not the rescue, but the failure to prevent, pointing to environmental impact assessment enforcement is poor, and hill area construction norms are not being followed very strictly. Urban building safety is also a concern, and how to build a climate resilient infrastructure. So the way forward is to have strict EIA compliance and audits. Slope stabilization technology has to be used, enforce the building codes, and put in early warning systems with community preparedness. Finally, let us look at history and culture. So India Indonesia launched joint restoration of uh, Prambanan temple. Prime Minister Modi, together with Indonesian President uh, Prabowo Subianto, visited the centuries-old Prabhanan temple complex in Yogyakarta and inaugurated a joint conservation project for UNESCO World Heritage Site. Prime Minister has described the initiative as a shining example of enduring civilizational bonds between India and Indonesia, which is rooted in shared heritage that connected the two people. So the Archaeological Survey of India will be the lead agency from Indian side, and then the Prime Minister traveled to Australia in the second leg of the three nation tour to deepen India Australia comprehensive strategic partnership. So, the Prambanan temple is a 9th century Hindu temple complex dedicated to Trimurti, who are Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, and stands as physical evidence of how deeply Indian religion, art, and architecture spread across the Southeast Asia in the classical era. So, a joint restoration is therefore an act of cultural diplomacy, soft power that reinforces the civilizational links and India's activist policy engagement with the ASEAN's largest economy. So, Archaeological Survey of India's role in conserving the heritage abroad, such as at Angkor Wat in Cambodia and Cham and Bagan temples elsewhere, turns the heritage into a strategic asset which will build goodwill and long-term ties between the nations. So the implication is that by doing this, India is cementing its soft power diplomacy and strengthening its activist policy and deepening India-Indonesia comprehensive strategic partnership. So way forward is to expand the heritage restoration partnerships and leverage the civilizational links for strategic depth in the Indo-Pacific region. Now the questions for the mains practice are: India's response to the West Asia crisis reflected strategic foresight and not luck. Examine India's energy security preparedness and its balancing act between Iran and the Israel-US and Gulf bloc. The second question is: the right to be forgotten must be balanced against open justice and free speech. Critically examine the Delhi High Court's framework and the role of DPDP Act 2023. Third question is: the revenues accrue to the union, but the burden of the welfare falls on the state. Discuss the vertical fiscal imbalance in the India's welfare architecture and suggest the reforms. Fourth question is: extreme short duration rainfall in an El Nino year is exposing the fragility of Western Ghats and the urban infrastructure. Discuss with reference to disaster risk reduction and uh, environmental impact assessment enforcement. Thank you. That's it for today. We will meet again tomorrow.